I sort of find myself in this area often thinking I've got clowns to the left of me and jokers to the right. So in the reform view of the world, you lose all of that. And I think actually this is a real space for conservative pragmatism to say, yes, we want to make sure energy is cheap. We want to make sure that's reliable. We are not going to put that at risk. But at the same time, we're not going to give up the benefits of being part of, a global climate change movement where we can actually provide a lot of these new exciting products. And I don't think that's where the Labour Party is, frankly. And we talked about the problems and the challenges that they've got. I think they are very myopically focused on just squeezing all the carbon of the UK system out without having any sort of care about what anyone else in the rest of the world is doing.
I'm Ben Houchin. This is the Blueprint Podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home, and we're going to lift the lid on centre-right politics in the UK. We're going to be speaking with influential figures from across the political spectrum to help understand how we can make centre-right politics relevant to people's lives again and turn it back into a political force for good. Welcome everybody to the Blueprint Podcast. Today's guest is Claire Coutinho. She is the MP for East Surrey since 2019. Big advocate for education, social justice and energy policy, some experience in the Treasury, I think background in economics, and in 2023 was appointed as the Secretary of State for energy security and net zero. Claire, thank you for coming on the podcast
Thanks
today.
so much for having me, Ben.
I've given you a very brief introduction there on the political side, but I like to start these things talking about the individuals we get on, because hopefully we've got lots of listeners from all backgrounds who aren't necessarily au fait with politics in the way that you and I are. But it'd be really interesting to get listeners a bit of an understanding about who Claire is, your background, your family, where you grew up, and really how you got involved in politics in the first place, which I think is always interesting when speaking to people, because people come at it from very different angles.
Well, it's funny you say that, because actually I didn't have a background in politics. So my parents came to the country in the 70s. They're both doctors. They came with £200 between them, and they had both grown up in India with not a lot of money between them. So, both families remember being poor growing up. And I remember when we used to go back to India to stay with one of my grandmothers, we would have lots of fun having what we used to call a bucket bath. And then I got a bit older and I realised actually it was just a tap in a bucket. So so they came from that experience, excited to come to the UK, thinking this was the land of opportunity. They massively valued education and hard work. And that's part of where I get my conservative principles from, is that idea that actually you are in control of your own destiny for the most part. And actually a lot of what happens in your life is reliant on you, that sense of personal responsibility, which I think is very common to the self-starter sort of immigrant who comes over theme.
You said they came across from India. Whereabouts did they settle in the UK then? Was that in Surrey or?
So we started in South London. So in sort of the end of Lewisham is a place called Leeby. So we were in, 2 up, 2 down terraced housing to begin with. And then in terms of my life, I was always very good at maths. I got a scholarship to a private school and ended up being the first person in my family to go to university. And I went to Oxford. I read maths and philosophy, and I didn't study economics, but those two branches, maths and philosophy, both encourage you to ask a lot of questions. And so that's where I sort of got a lot of my training, and what I used, to be fair, when I was a Secretary of State, is a lot of that, just being unafraid to ask a lot of questions. And that shaped, again, how I approach politics. And I think the thing I like about the Conservatives is that we are often quite practical. We don't mind sort of questioning the consensus which the left tries to create. There's one side which is good, there's one side which is bad. We like to have free speech, we like to have debate, and ultimately I think that's the best way to get to the right answers for the country.
Well, it's like the old adage, isn't it? We deal with the world as it is rather than as we would like it to be, whereas the socialists tend to deal with the world as they would like it to be rather than the reality. And that's one of the reasons I think the party's been as successful as it has been. But was it then in Oxford that you first got exposed to politics or involved in politics, or did that happen before university? Or how did that come about?
No, so I always describe my career as if you've got a dog and there's a trail of dog biscuits, and they find the first biscuit and then they sniff out and there's another biscuit a bit down the line and there's another biscuit after that. That's what happened to me. So I started off in finance, actually.
Okay.
And then I horrified my parents by quitting that and taking a 70% pay cut. And I went to work in social justice. And I worked with people, from all different parts of the country in all different walks of life, struggling with different things and looking particularly at sort of regeneration of deprived communities as well. And
who was that with?
So that was firstly with the Centre for Social Justice. So that was Ian Duncan Smith's think tank, which is an amazing outfit, because what it does is it goes and works with all these grassroots charities, people on the ground, who are really turning people's lives around, and you go and look at why they've managed to make that transformation. And it's usually two things. Firstly, the power of relationships. They understand that actually when people are really in the most dire of circumstances, it's the people around them that actually can get them out of that hole. And also, it's that sense of personal agency that was often the common thread of being able to give people a bit more power and a bit more control in their lives. And if you contrast that with, again, the left's view of the world, which is basically that the state has all the answers and you can't get on in life unless the state gives you all of the helping hands. Not saying that it shouldn't give you any helping hand, but it has to give you all of the helping hands. I thought actually just seeing time and time again all of those different charities in all different circumstances, dealing with all different problems, having the same solutions ultimately, which is, people, family, communities, and giving people that ability to have some power and control in their lives. So that I think is very conservative.
So where does that come from? I mean, I'm just thinking you kind of grew up in South London, scholarship, university, finance, and then all of a sudden you think, I'm going to go and work for the CSJ. How did you get exposed to the CSJ? How did that come about?
Well, I mean, that was something that I'd done my whole life. So I started when I was 16. That was when I started volunteering. My Saturday mornings, I did a literacy scheme.
All right.
And
with the CSJ itself, or
no. That was just when I was at school,
right.
And I always did stuff like that. So at uni, I did respite breaks for SEND children, and I at times worked with like homeless children and all different types of people. And I think partly it was my parents both being doctors, sort of having that sort of sense of service, and also, as I say now in my current constituency role as an MP, I started a local charity to support some of my grassroots charities in East Surrey. Actually, I think the act of volunteering and doing some of those things, it actually is, there are more benefits for the volunteer than the other person sometimes. It's something which I think is very joyful. And also I grew up in a sort of church community, so that sense of congregation of people coming together, I think was sort of part of it as well.
Oh, fantastic. And so did politics come in once you started to work for the CSJ, or had you been involved and exposed to politics before then?
So that's when I first started seeing politicians in action. And
were you a member of the party by then? So
that's when I became a member of the party. Okay. So that was that moment, again, like I said, seeing all of those people, giving people control in their lives and the effect that had. That's when I joined the party, because I thought actually these guys have much better ideas. And across the piece, whether it's the economy, where you want to give people more control of how they spend their money, companies more control of which products they can create and how they can sell them, and sort of free markets, or just generally for your people to have more freedom. That's part of our belief system, and that's what I think is really important, and also what I think is under threat at the moment if you look at some of the things that Labour want to do.
Yeah. So did you grow up as, I mean, what I often hear when I speak to friends and colleagues and politicians, and we've had lots of people on the Blueprint podcast, they tend to start their political journey, I've found there seems to be a common thread of kind of being an enlightenment, for want of a better phrase, between kind of like 10, 12, 13. Yours seems to have started much later.
I was a late bloomer.
Yeah.
I was a late bloomer.
You seem to have come in from the approach of kind of a social justice angle, getting involved in the community, and then you found politics. Whereas I think a lot of politicians I've spoken to tend to get kind of the bug of politics. They know. I mean, I noticed it when I was 11. That was the first time I was aware of politics, and that kind of took me on a journey, a bit like the breadcrumb dog biscuit analogy that you gave. It's like over time it kind of leads you there.
Yeah.
Whereas yours was a slightly different approach.
I was definitely a late bloomer, so I did have actually as
not necessarily a bad thing. Right? I mean, I've always believed that the Young Conservatives was not necessarily the healthiest of organisations to be involved with. Not that I'm asking you to comment, Claire.
But I did have Roger Scruton as a lecturer at university, and that I remembered.
Oh, did you?
Yes, I remember sort of reading some stuff about Conservatism then, but I wasn't really that engaged. I was someone who kind of got lured into it, and I think it's interesting because actually I think that's reflective of quite a lot of people nowadays. A lot of people nowadays aren't very political, and we in government sit there and we think, oh, I've made this announcement and I've got this headline, everybody will now know about my amazing policy X, whatever it might be. And actually most people are not thinking about the stuff for the vast majority of the time, and I think having that sort of slow burn entry into politics always made me quite cognizant of actually most people aren't listening to what you're saying at any given moment, so you've got to try really hard to get your message across in different ways.
And so how did that come about? So CSJ, you started to become aware of politics. When did you think, actually elected office was something that you were keen to pursue?
So I then went into government to be a special advisor. And, one of the people I worked with was Rishi at the Treasury, and I did sort of Whip's office during Brexit times as well. And that's when I started meeting MPs more. I mean, I hadn't really met politicians in my life before that. I was never that person growing up who'd written to my MP or had really any interaction whatsoever.
And it's like most normal people, really.
Yeah, exactly.
You make it sound like it's weird, but no, it's perfectly normal.
It seems weird now because so many people write to us.
Yeah.
You think, is there anyone left who hasn't written to me? So I think doing that, you realise, despite what people think from the outside, and I realise that we come across as a very weird breed, actually the vast majority of MPs are very normal people. They are from a big range of backgrounds, maybe not broad enough, but still they're a broad range of people, and what they're trying to do is help their communities in different ways. And particularly that constituency side of the role really appealed to me. Like I said, my mum and my sister are GPs, so that sense of being part of a community and being able to give them your service was familiar to me, and I liked that. And I don't think there is anything else like it. So firstly, you get to have a lot of people contact. So my favourite thing that I do still is my MP surgeries, where people come in and you can talk to them face to face about whatever is going on in their life. And that is sometimes, really difficult challenges, really sort of heartbreaking stuff, and sometimes sort of completely hilarious sort of engagements that you have with people. So it's such a big spectrum. But you get to do all of that sort of massive sort of people contact. And then you also get to go and look at national problems, and you can apply all of these very personal conversations that you've had with people to these massive national problems. And I don't think anybody else gets to do that. If you think about chief executives or even sort of politicians who are more removed in other countries who don't have that representative democracy, they're all very far away from the people that they're trying to serve. Whereas actually our roles, you and sort of your mayoral role, and us as Member of Parliament, we're really intertwined. And I think that's what's so special about it all.
No, it is. I mean, I say to people, unless you've been involved in politics in a significant way, you can't understand what it's actually about from a day-to-day point of view. I mean, if anybody's listening and hasn't seen it, I mean, you'll have watched it, Claire. You must have seen it In the Loop.
Yes.
You've seen In the Loop, obviously. For anybody listening, Blueprint podcasters, In the Loop is a fantastic film. It was, in effect, a standalone film from the thick of it. Yeah. Same cast. And I think I say to people, if you want a little bit, I appreciate it's a bit of a caricature, but if you want a little bit of an insight and a snippet as to what politics is actually like, just watch that film. And the bit that I always tell people about is the bit where he sat in his surgery and he's got, I don't know what the character is, but Steve Coogan comes in, who's playing a local constituent, who's complaining to him as the local MP because his constituency office is located next door and his wall's fallen down. And he's complaining about the wall falling down, and what are you as the MP going to do about the wall in my back garden? And at the same time, he's a minister in a national government who's dealing with trying to prevent, I think he's trying to prevent anyway in the process, World War III, and dealing with issues around Russia and America. And I think he's at the UN or a big international conference trying to deal with it. And he gets a call on his mobile. And I think it's the Steve Coogan character manages to get hold of his mobile number and is ringing him about this wall. And it's this meeting of two worlds, isn't it? Yeah. Between the ultra-local, but particularly in a ministerial position when you're in government, just the ultra, supranational, not just national politics. And it's, like you say, a chief executive of a big international corporation wouldn't deal with that spread of both individuals, but also the difference day to day from the very big to the very local.
Yeah, and I think it's really special.
It is. I mean, it is. And I think that's one of the reasons that a certain type of person gets drawn to politics, because it is. I mean, one of the things that I love about politics is every day is different. You don't know what today's going to bring. And it could be the ultra-local or it could be kind of the national stuff. But it's the eclectic nature of the job, which is just... It's wonderful. It's also very stressful. And as a result, and it goes back to your point that I think it draws people to it who... Yes, it's good to have specialisms in certain areas, but you've got to have people who are inquisitive, ask questions, are willing to get into the detail and learn constantly on the job to be able to ideally make the right decision in the right circumstance, given the information that's available. Yeah,
and actually one of my favourite stories, and I better not name the person in case I'm not meant to tell the story publicly, and you can edit this out if it's too boring.
Or if it's too controversial and you're saying, Ben, we don't want to put this on.
It's not that controversial. But one of my favourite stories was a senior politician told me they were at this international conference with Angela Merkel, and it was some, important international thing. And back home in their constituency, they had local floods. So they kept having to dash out the room to talk to different groups of constituents about these floods. And Angela Merkel apparently found this just really quite funny. And she kept telling everyone, listen to him talk about his floods. Because she just thought it was extraordinary that he would have to do this. But again, I think that is wonderful that we always have that connection, because it keeps us rooted. And arguably, where we've gone wrong in the past is where we lose that connection with the people that we're representing. We get too sucked into the bureaucracy of government and whatever sort of particular system of targets, whatever it might be, and then you don't hear that voice of the people saying your attention's in the wrong place and you're focusing on the wrong thing.
But even with good people, I find once you get into there is a Westminster bubble, it does exist, and I think if you can spend a lot of time in London and you don't try and keep yourself grounded or keep tethered to the local constituency and local people, then it's very easy to get detached, because whether it's colleagues sitting together, within that bubble, the media kind of then play into that. It is very easy to kind of get sucked into it and lose sight of why we're all actually putting ourselves forward for elected office.
That's what you're doing on the podcast, bursting the bubble.
Trying to, getting rid of the mainstream media, going straight to the people. But so you obviously elected in 2019. Gave you a very brief and bit of a disservice to your introduction, because you've been in Parliament for less than 5 years, but held a number of significant jobs, including Secretary of State for Energy and Net Zero. That is a hell of a career in 4 short years.
Well, I could say the same to you, but it might get quite sickening if we keep going back and forth. But yes, no, it was amazing. And I think for me, that energy brief was so important, because in the past I had done stuff on the economy, I'd done stuff with people who were low income, and I do care about climate change. I want to make sure all of those things can pull in the right direction. And of all the briefs that there are in government right now, I think energy is one of the areas where we have the biggest battle of ideas. The biggest differences between us and the left are how we think about energy policy and net zero. And if we don't have those debates, if we don't think properly about what you're going to do to provide cheap energy in this country and what you're going to do to think about global carbon emissions, and if we have all that debate shut down, then we'll end up in the wrong place, and it will be catastrophic, not just for the UK, but also for countries around the world. So that's why I think it was a real privilege to be able to do it, because for me it was quite eye-opening. I said a few things which were quite controversial, but it's an argument that I think needs to be had.
Well, it's fantastic. This is one of the podcasts that I've recorded so far that I've been the most looking forward to. One, because obviously you're on, Claire, but two, we are both, I think, to be fair to say, energy geeks as well.
Yes.
And I do think you're absolutely right. This is a particular policy area that is quite technical and detailed, but actually is having a huge impact on people's personal lives.
Yeah.
If we want to take it forward to literally people's energy bills on a monthly basis, right the way through to the net zero transition for the legislative target that we have for 2050. So if we start on this, we're going to try and walk listeners through this. And the way that I thought we should start is, as the previous Secretary of State, or the last Secretary of State in the most recent Conservative government, when you were there, what was the Conservative energy policy and the net zero policy? What were we there to try and achieve?
Well, so it was interesting when I came in, because actually we had this turning point. So before that, we had obviously passed legislation on net zero, fully signed up to everything. And there was almost a view, which you see in the climate change lobby at the moment, is, you cannot go quickly enough in the UK. No pace is too fast. We've just got to keep going. And that's the way to win the race, which is basically the Ed Miliband view now. He wants to do all of this stuff at breakneck speed. And we came in and looked at it all and said, actually, hang on a second. You can't have your clean energy outstripping the importance of cheap energy. And that is something which I think Ed Miliband and Labour are going to do. If you do that, then what you end up doing is you will lose your businesses here, and they'll move abroad to countries which have more polluting energy systems. So here we've taken coal off the grid, but in places like China, there's 60% coal. So if you're moving a factory from the UK to China, you're actually increasing global carbon emissions. That doesn't make any sense. So even if you don't focus on the household bills and the pain that will cause, or the taxes that will rise and the pain that will cause, just from a pure, are you reducing climate change and are you dealing with carbon emissions in a sensible way point of view, that makes no sense. So, we came in and we looked at some of these different things, and the approach that, Rishi talked about and I was talking about is actually we've got to be really sensible about these things. There is definitely a way that we can do the energy transition. There's a way that we can do that, which I think is really positive for the country. And actually we should talk about the stuff that you were doing in Teesside, because that was a prime example of how you can do this well. But if you get this wrong, what you'll end up is a country which has really expensive energy, households who are suffering, businesses which have gone abroad, and the rest of the world is watching. So what are they going to do? They're clearly not going to follow the example that we've set. So actually you've really caused a huge problem, I think, in the whole overall climate change agenda. So far from being a difference between us, the climate change deniers, and the left, who are the climate change believers, this is a question of how. And that was the policies that we had set out and the debate that we were having.
Because what I found out, I spoke to him quite a lot about this, Boris's view, and I think it was one of the things that he thought brought the 2019 election together, was marrying levelling up with the decarbonisation agenda. He thought was a really winning formula, and actually he went much further than people realise, particularly around things like offshore wind, that wouldn't have happened if it hadn't have been for that agenda. Now, you coming in 2023, I mean, even with those subtle changes, I mean, it was still government policy to kind of go hell for leather for things like offshore wind, and the idea that we have the electrification of, in effect, our energy network. And at some point what we'll do is we'll be able to move technology on from a battery standpoint to be able to store that electricity so that when it's generated during the night when nobody's using it, it can still be just charged during the day. And over time that will drive down prices. You're saying, we were trying to get to a more measured transition, but the government stated policy was still, in effect, decarbonise it as quickly as possible, more offshore wind. We want to push these technologies and subsidise to help for the technology curve. How were you able to try and square it? Because it seemed from the outside quite difficult to square that circle of having those stated goals while also trying to say we still need a managed transition to make sure that it doesn't hit people in their pockets.
Yeah, and look, the two things were, like, where are their costs coming down the line for families? And one of those things, for example, was there was a boiler ban that was coming in very, very short order when clearly the market wasn't ready. So I think taking some time for, as you say, for the cost of technologies to come down was where we sort of were saying, let's give people time to be able to pay for some of these things and make sure that we're doing that in a way that isn't heaping costs on families who've just been through a really difficult time. And secondly, in the energy space, I wanted to see a lot of energy, and I wanted to see that as cheap as possible. So we do, offshore wind is actually, got a really high load factor compared to some of the other winds. So, for example, offshore wind is about 48% now in terms of its efficiency, its load factor. Onshore wind is 22%, and solar is about 10%. So we were doing a lot of offshore wind because actually we're quite lucky in this country. We've got the geology and the infrastructure to be able to do that. But I also really cared, and this is the key thing, about the technologies that came online in the future. So when you look at things like fusion energy, for example, carbon capture or small modular reactors or space solar, something which is in its very early stages, all of that innovation which could be applied not just here but to countries around the world, that was where I put a huge amount of my focus in the things that I was getting government to sort of help get off the ground. Now, the problem that you've got with Labour's approach in 2030, and, arguably you could say with our approach in 2035, is that if something was going to come online after that, it might get deprioritised. Actually, that wasn't happening under me, but I do think it is happening under Labour. So you see, for example, the small modular reactor nuclear programme, which could provide really cheap nuclear energy, something that I was very positive. I think Boris kicked it off originally, and successive energy secretaries thought this is a really good idea. We've heard radio silence about that. Things like fusion energy. We're now the most exciting place in the world when it comes to the development of fusion energy. Don't ever hear about that anymore. Carbon capture, I know, something that you're very passionate about, which again has a huge potential to transform some of our industrial heartlands. Again, not hearing a huge amount about that either, because the Labour approach is to put a lot of wind and a lot of solar at breakneck speed to try and get to this 2030 target. But ultimately, that isn't the ball game for me, because that's about the UK's emissions, which is 1% of global emissions. But where we could really have a huge impact is innovating new technologies. You talked about long duration storage, for example. Yep. Nobody's properly cracked that yet. But coming up with these new technologies which deal with the 99% of emissions that don't happen here.
But if you look at those new technologies, and the thing is, it's obvious that there's no clear answer to this, so I don't ask it in a kind of a pointed way, but if you look at things like carbon capture, for instance, of which we know a lot about in Teesside because we've got the Net Zero Teesside project, which hopefully the government will be approving imminently. Going to your point as to whether they're going to support it or not, that is big base load. It's decarbonisation of gas. It's going to decarbonise 1.4 million homes or the equivalent of, but in effect going into industry. That is a technology that we absolutely need. It's going to allow for a transition in a more managed way that isn't going to hit people in their pockets as much as if you were just going hell for leather for things like solar, as you rightly said. But we also have to be honest and say, but there is a cost to new technologies. So even concentrating on those new technologies that you talked about, there is a CFD, there is a subsidy that is required. And one of the things that we have to acknowledge that even with those new technologies, to get them over the line, they need to be de-risked because otherwise investors just won't move towards it. And by requiring that subsidy, somebody has to pay for it. Now, ultimately, the government are underwriting it in usually a CFD format because that's a very popular format since the advent of offshore wind because it's been such a success, as many people would say. But that's requiring taxpayers' money. So really, it's the taxpayer paying for it, either directly through their bill or through taxation. So again, because one of the things that I've seen, particularly over the election, is there are a few people asking more questions, particularly as they see their bills rise. And one of the things they see is this push hell for leather for net zero, and they kind of try and associate the two. Now, some of it is obviously attributable to net zero because there are green levies, there are levies on people's bills that are there to pay for that over the next 30, 40 years. But it's not the whole case. So I'm just trying to, I'm going around the houses here, but going back to your original point of trying to concentrate on those new technologies, how do you bring them online without it costing the taxpayer more?
Well,
or is it even possible?
So let's talk about the technologies and then let's talk about the costs and people's bills, because I think both are very interesting subjects and worthy of their own time. So in terms of innovation, I do think that government has a role to play in terms of subsidising getting these things off the ground. But actually, I just made a speech today. One of the things that I talked about a bit in the role is the way that can work for the country is when you think about those export potentials. Yep. So again, just coming back to the current system that we've got, and look, I am a bit freer to talk now because obviously we're in opposition and nobody's screening what I say anymore. I think the problem that we've got now is that our system is focused myopically on domestic emissions. And you're right, if you're just creating these technologies and then buying them and implementing here, that is a lot of subsidy. But if you're thinking about, again, that coming back to that 99%, if you're creating technologies here which then get exported abroad, then that means you get investment here, you get jobs here, you get tax receipts here, and that is, I think, a very good thing. And you see that in different countries around the world. So funnily enough, the left really like to talk about the IRA in the US, which is creating sort of new industries and new technologies. Reduction Act. Yes.
Just of for course, those listeners that may not know.
The reason why I find that funny is because that is in part funded by the fact that the US is now the largest oil and gas exporter in the world. Mm. And, you can talk about...
well, most of their decarbonisation over the last 10 years was, they went all in on fracking.
Yeah.
Certainly since 2016 under Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And like I said, that's when they became the net exporter because of fracking.
Yeah, a lot of cheap energy. Mm. And, you can look at somewhere like China, which is, yes, admittedly building some renewables, but also building an awful lot of coal, an awful lot of gas, buying a lot of oil. And again, thinking about the export of new technologies. Now, Britain is one of the most innovative countries in the world. We've always punched above our weight. We've always been at the forefront of creating new products and being able to sell them around the world. If we were thinking about net zero in that sort of way, not only would we, I think, do well to be able to create those new technologies, but we'd create new forms of wealth in this country, which I think is a really good thing. And what we'd be doing is we'd be using our expertise in innovation, our expertise in energy, because again, we've been an energy producer, so we know a thing or two about this, and we'd be helping to solve some of these problems for other countries. So we'd be playing a bigger role in global climate change, thinking about that 99%, than just focusing on our own 1%. And that's where I think Labour and actually a lot of the arguments around the energy transition is missing the mark at the moment.
Well, there are also two parts to that as a conversation in that, again, going back to offshore wind is the perfect example pilot of this whole thing. We created the global market for offshore wind. We've got the biggest offshore wind farms being built, Dogger Bank, which is just off the Teesside coastline. One of the problems we had with that is, yes, we created the market, but we didn't create the supply chain. Yeah. And that was our fault, as in the Conservative government's fault, in that we created what the government like to call supply chain plans, where offshore wind licensees would in effect say, we want to build an offshore wind farm. here's what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it. And they would put in a supply chain plan that showed how they would use quote unquote local content, and how would they bring manufacturing back to the UK for offshore wind. And one of the things I had, and it was before your time, Claire, so this is absolutely not your fault, but I had repeatedly with lots of different ministers, both in what was the Department of Business at the time and the Treasury, there was a target of 50% UK content in those supply chain plans. But I said to the government, but if nobody has it in, and everybody gets penalised because nobody has local content in it, nobody really gets penalised because everybody's getting penalised. And actually, when you look at offshore wind, other than a factory in the Humber and a new factory that's being built on Teesside, we have none of the supply chain in the UK. And I think we are about to, if not actually already, missed the boat on hydrogen. We've missed the boat on solar. I think somebody told me more than 90% of all solar panels are now built in China. We saw the same with offshore wind. Actually, the Chinese are the ones...
And by the way, this is going to get worse.
This is going to get worse with new technologies. So I absolutely agree. Things like carbon capture, we've still got the opportunity because of, we're going to be building the world's first CCUS plant right here in the UK. So there is still that opportunity. One of the things that the government didn't do, and I know all things come back to this, we didn't use Brexit to be able to force those supply chain plans to require UK content. So we kind of said we want to do a little bit, but if you don't, we're not going to force it. Whereas other countries seem to act like the Americans, for instance, but the America First policy, they say you want to build in the US, you're building your factory in the US. Whereas the UK, we don't really do that.
So this is exactly what I was trying to do in post. So firstly, we now have changed the way that we're going to contract renewables from the next auction round. So auction round 7 is the next one. And that now will come with a sustainable industry reward. So actually you are able to make sure the supply chain in Britain is able to benefit from the fact that we want to build a lot of that stuff here. And secondly,
what are the teeth to that? Because that's the thing I always said to people. I mean, I'd love an answer. Or a solution, not necessarily what's in place, but if they don't, what can the government do that actually has teeth to make them do it, or pull the contract from them?
Well, so if they sign up to it and then they don't deliver, then that will be looked at in the way the sustainable industry rewards are created. But the point is that if you are going to be building a lot of stuff here, so for example, you want to do this energy transition, you want to beef up your grid, you want to put some offshore wind in, all of those things require a bit of time to build up a British supply chain, because you're right, we haven't had enough of it here.
Yep.
So partly is the signposting and the prodding that you can do in the contracting of that auction round 7 that I talked about, but partly it's also getting those businesses off the ground. And actually, this is the amazing thing when I came to Teesside and saw the work that you were doing, is actually there's a lot of work that goes around that. It's not just about can I get the contract, it's also can I get the planning permission, can I get the grid access, can I get the workers, can I get the finance. All of those things take time. And so I had a fund which was the Green Industries Growth Accelerator, which was looking at where are there supply chain constraints, for example, and how can we make sure that we get some British companies off the ground. But none of those things are going to be ready by 2030, which is when Ed wants to deliver his decarbonised grid.
Absolutely not the scale that he's saying to fully decarbonise the grid, absolutely.
So his point about, let's
just cut through it, right?
Yeah.
It is physically impossible for us to decarbonise by 2030. It's just not going to happen.
Well, I mean, the question that you have to ask yourself, and, I'm asking Labour, is when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining in 2030, what are you using to power your grid?
Well, yeah. I mean, they would say in a very small way you'd have CCUS, but one plant in Teesside, which will be fantastic. They're not going to be multiple plants to be able to solve the problem for the whole of the UK.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you still get, I think it's 40, sometimes 60% of electricity from gas,
absolutely.
Right? So what are you going to be using? And if it is gas, that means it's probably the height of winter, and we're a marginal pricing country, and they have put forward no plans to get away from that. So it's still gas that's going to be pricing your electricity. So, I mean, their idea of a decarbonised grid is something which at the moment is completely vacuous. It's not set out at all. And the risk is that you end up, which is sort of what's happening at the moment, is people don't invest in the gas that we'll probably need. They're slowing down on nuclear, which I think they think takes too long. And you're not investing in these new technologies which come in line after 2030. So you'll have a system which just has a huge amount of intermittence on it and nothing really to back it up.
Well, and I think there is probably some truth in it. I hope, to be fair, I hope we're both wrong, Claire, particularly around small modular reactors and nuclear, because all of the timelines, even the realistic timelines, it's 2030, 2031, and that's breakneck.
And that's prototype. That's prototype.
That's prototype. Yeah. That's breakneck speed. That's not mass rollout.
Yeah.
So you could see where they've set out a 2030 target. They've in effect discounted, or the allegation could be that they've discounted it completely because it falls out of the timeline.
Well, this is what I worry about. I just don't want to see those things deprioritised, because I think ultimately they might actually be better solutions in how you get a lot of cheap, clean energy in the system. But we were talking about sort of bringing industry back, so let me just come back to that.
Yeah, no, please do.
The other thing that you need to do to make sure that industry is actually building the stuff here, as well as giving yourself time, making sure you've got some of these programs, like I said, the work that you've done in terms of putting together planning, grid, all of those pieces of the puzzle, I think is really important. But also you need cheap energy. That's the other crucial thing. So if you're making your energy really expensive, of course you are not going to lure industry here. What you're going to do is send industry abroad. And just coming back to the point that I was making earlier, where is that industry going to go at the moment? It's probably going to go to countries which are powered by a lot of coal. So that, again, is just counterproductive. And I think the whole problem that I've got...
Well, this has been something you've been championing for a while, about the risk of not just new manufacturing, but the risk of deindustrialisation in the UK.
Yeah.
And you're saying that's down to, in effect, inbuilt high energy pricing that drives away a lot of that manufacturing.
Yeah, if no country has succeeded without having cheap energy. And I think this is when I say, look, there's a sort of fork in the road here between us and the Labour Party's approach, is that I think we need to ruthlessly prioritise cheap energy and make sure that we are doing clean energy in a way that doesn't jeopardise that. So you can maybe add a bit of cost to the system. We should be honest about what those are. But you can't add very much cost to the system to make a huge gap between us and other countries. Otherwise, again, you'll just move your businesses abroad and you'll end up being in a country which is got clean energy but is poor and cold. So, that's not going to work for anyone.
No, absolutely. And to play devil's advocate on it, I can already hear what some people might be thinking in response is, well, that's all very well and good, but the way to tackle that is through CBAM, through the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, where, in effect, you put, for those people that don't know, you put a tax on imports into the UK and products that in effect are generated through carbon intensive means. So the argument of saying, well, you know what, if we're importing more products that should be built in the UK from China because they're producing cheap products using cheap energy from, say, coal, actually they won't be able to import it because it'll be cost prohibitive, because there'll be a tax in the UK that means that the UK product will be cheaper than the Chinese product. Now, I appreciate, I'm also arguing against the devil's advocate point, which is all that does is just raise the cost for everybody, right? Because
that's the thing.
UK costs are still going to be high, because energy costs are still going to be high.
And the thing that you have to ask those businesses is, are you happy just supplying the UK, right? Because then your ability to export is diminished. And actually you can look at, I think we've talked before about the steel sector, you can look at refineries, and actually all across Europe, people are voting to leave, right?
Well, we've seen this just recently with Grangemouth, the announcement of Grangemouth closing its refinery because of government's energy policy.
Well, Grangemouth, I think Scunthorpe, and Port Talbot as well. And if you lose these big sort of industrial specialities, then all of your follow-on sectors suffer, as you know. Like, it's not just that sector. I've talked about oil and gas in the past. It's not just the oil and gas. It's actually all of those supply chains, everything that sits downstream of that as well.
Well, you've touched upon steel. I mean, there are lots of problems with the steel industry, and there's a whole separate episode to do on steel policy in this country over the last 50 years. But the single biggest driver to the problem with producing primary steel in this country is energy cost.
Yeah.
That's the vast majority of the cost of running a steel business. Now, we can talk about the move to electric arc furnaces, renewable steel, recycled steel, etc. Actually, things like HBI, which helps you produce primary steel. Again, we won't get into the detail of that. But even with electric arc furnaces that this government is saying they want to build, hugely energy intensive, which still means that the cost of steel is going to be expensive when compared with particularly those in the Far East and even our American friends across the pond.
Yeah, and I come back to this point about you can't be just purely obsessed with your own domestic emissions, because I'm sure there will be people, and admittedly they'll sit on the fringes of the debate, who will be quietly cheering if our steel sector shuts down, because they'll look at the carbon emissions and they'll go, hooray, our carbon emissions are lower. But actually all you've done is you've just shifted that production to, probably someone like China, again, which is going to use a much dirtier system to produce that same amount of steel that then you're importing over here. So nobody is a win from that approach. And I think we need to be really clear-eyed about what we mean when we say we're lowering carbon emissions, we think that's a good thing. And if it's just moving industry abroad because your energy is really expensive, then actually that isn't lowering global carbon emissions.
So we've kind of looked at what the Conservative policy was. We've actually veered off piste a couple of times and just talked about energy policy in general. But one of the interesting things that we're trying to explore on the podcast is also what is the future for centre-right politics in the UK? And I think energy policy is a really interesting one because, you know, we've talked about the problems, we've talked about, and I can't disagree with anything you said, Claire, we need to lower energy costs, we need to be more competitive. I actually think we can reshore manufacturing back to the UK in a sensible way, never mind just manage what we've already got. But how do we do that? So, if wave a magic wand, you're in the leadership contest, Claire, or you've just become leader of the Conservative Party, maybe foreshadowing something long into the future.
I don't think that's where the dog biscuits lead then.
Nobody knows where the dog biscuits lead. That's the beauty of politics. What is the solution for a centre-right policy on? What are we saying to Mrs. Smith in Doncaster or Bolton or Hampstead? How should the centre-right help lower people's energy costs? What is the solution? We've set out largely the problem, but what's the solution for people? I
think we should be saying to people, look, our priority is going to be cheap energy. That's what we're going to do for you, your household,
just more oil and gas?
For businesses. Not necessarily. What you have to look at is the way the entire system works together. And that does mean that you want some renewables on the system, but I don't think means you want a majority renewable systems, because that becomes very unreliable and you have to have very expensive backups. So you want to have the overall mix which makes it as clean as possible whilst maintaining that priority, which is this energy's got to be cheap for you, your household, and for businesses in this country. And then secondly, I think when it comes to net zero, my personal opinion is that we should be focusing on an export strategy. So we should be saying, actually, Britain is amazing when it comes to innovation. We've talked about, I don't know how many new technologies so far. As you say, we're both sort of slightly dorky on this subject. All of those things will create jobs, they'll create local economies, they'll create investment in this country. That's good for Britain, and also it's good for the rest of the world that Britain is playing its part in a global challenge. So I think we can be really optimistic about that and say what we want to do is, as you say, bring industry back to these shores, but also create all of these innovative areas in different parts of the country. And again, the opportunity there is, this is something which is not just happening in cities, it's happening in all of the regions, and that is the most fun thing about the energy space. It's happening in Grimsby, it's happening in Teesside, it's happening in Cornwall. We've got a lithium mine, which is opening up. And actually, this is something which can bring growth and prosperity to the entire country if we do it right.
Well, this is it, and I think that's why I think the transition is important. I actually think the transition is, in the short term, much more important economically than it is from a climate point of view, because, like you say, it's a global conversation. It's not something that the UK could solve by itself. But the prize is invariably concentrated in areas of the country, red wall areas, deprived areas, outside of our metropolitan areas with higher levels of wages. It speaks to the levelling up story as well, which I think is absolutely essential. Now, if we move on ever so slightly, I mean, it's all very well and good us talking about this, but there is also the public. I mean, politics is also about the public and public perception. And I feel like the public is in two slightly different places, in that when they get their energy bill through the door, they want a cheap energy bill, like everybody does. That goes without saying, really. But at the same time, there is a huge positivity around the decarbonisation and the net zero agenda. People care about the planet, they care about climate change. And so that puts us in a difficult spot, I think, as a Conservative Party. So I'd be interested to get your views, because it feels to me at the minute, one, we'll have to see what happens as the Conservative Party kind of gets up and running again and sets out its stall. But we have the Lib Dems and Labour on one side of us, who are pushing hell for leather, like I say, the Ed Miliband one extreme, saying decarbonise at all cost, and we just need to go after solar, and we need to go after onshore and offshore wind. And actually, at the other end of the scale, you've got Reform and Nigel Farage basically saying this is all a scam, it's all subsidies for big business, actually your bills are going up because of the net zero policies. Where does the Conservative Party find its space from a policy point of view, and how do we communicate that to the public in a way that is going to be electorally beneficial?
Well, I sort of find myself in this area often thinking I've got clowns to the left of me and jokers to the right, because neither of those approaches that you just talked about work. So on the one hand, you've got a Labour Party who, as you say, not only do they not care about the costs of their approach, they don't want to talk about it at all. They want to pretend that their approach is going to be cost-free to people. You saw them in the election talking a lot about how they were going to save people £300 on their energy bills. Obviously, they're not saying that anymore because they've got no idea how to do that. But for them, it's very...
energy bills have just gone up.
Exactly. But for them, it's completely ideological, which is not the right approach. On the other side, you've got Reform, who say there is no benefit to any of this agenda. So whether it's innovation or creating jobs, as you've done in Teesside, how many jobs have you created?
So far, we've contractually secured about 9,000 jobs.
I just gave you space to have a little plug
there. You did.
There.
No, that's fantastic. Nobody ever does that. You're the only one that's ever done that, Claire.
No, but this is an amazing thing, right? So
absolutely.
if we could, do what you've done in Teesside to 4, 5, 6 more areas of the country. And when I came, I met people, we were door knocking together, and you could see the excitement they felt, the renewed sense of optimism, the fact that there were all these amazing jobs and exciting jobs coming to the area.
And again, it goes to your point that a lot of what drives that in places, well, in my area like Teesside, a lot of it is the economic pride. It's the the reindustrialisation. It's the manufacturing. It's the economic opportunity. It's the jobs. It's the wages. And yes, people care about the climate, but I would say, by some distance, people care about, in effect, the economic regeneration of the region through net zero as their priority.
Exactly. So in the Reform view of the world, you lose all of that. And I think actually this is a real space for conservative pragmatism to say, yes, we want to make sure energy is cheap. We want to make sure that's reliable. We are not going to put that at risk. But at the same time, we're not going to give up the benefits of being part of a global climate change movement where we can actually provide a lot of these new exciting products. And I don't think that's where the Labour Party is, frankly, and we talked about the problems and the challenges that they've got. I think they are very myopically focused on just squeezing all the carbon of the UK system out without having any sort of care about what anyone else in the rest of the world is doing. And then I don't think that's where the Reform groups are, who just say, actually, we want to make this at all a negative story and that there's no potential for anything good to happen in the UK here. And actually, I think we can be the sensible people in the middle on this one.
But one of the things that I'll ask you, because not that, again, you were involved in this, but you've been involved with the Treasury at some point, so you understand Treasury think, and you understand how Treasury kind of model their behaviour, and obviously on the security side as well, on the energy security anyway. One of the things that I'd heard from both previous ministers and also civil servants in departments rather than the Treasury, they would tell me that Treasury's view of the world is we don't need to do any of this. Because, the economic model in the UK is we would rather the Germans or the Chinese or the Americans spend all of their taxpayers' money developing these new technologies. And then all we would do is import that technology because it'd be really cheap then because they'll have in effect gone through that technology curve. And then we'll be the beneficiaries of then spending taxpayers' money to import into the UK. Again, how do we, again, it's a big question really, but there's also this inbuilt systematic problem you have with the Treasury of kind of its pure economic thinking, that the Treasury itself doesn't take into account kind of the research, the development, the IP, the exports, because it takes a very purist economic view of the cost of technology compared with, the price per kilowatt for gas compared to, onshore wind, nuclear, whatever it might be.
So, I worked both in the Whip's office and the Treasury, so I often said to other people in Whitehall that I worked in the two places where good ideas go to die. What
a depressing place to work.
Not to say that there aren't. Look, obviously there's some amazing people in all of these areas, but I think the challenge that you've got is that Treasury is facing a lot of costs. They've got, in their minds, an ageing population, which has a need for public services. We've got growth that we need to get up, but is currently not where it needs to be to pay for all of that. And I think the official position is that they think net zero, if we don't do anything about it, is a longer cost in the longer term, but a bigger cost in the longer term. But they worry about how much that they are able to spend here and now. And that's why, firstly, a lot has got to come from private sector capital. And actually, when people saw me supporting the oil and gas industry, that was because actually a lot of these companies are integrated energy industries. And They are the people that we are getting the most amount of investment. As you will know from Teesside, I remember we talked about all the different companies investing in clean energy. And the less that you get from the private sector, the more you'll have to get from the Treasury. And the second part, which is a challenge, is this point around innovation, is that I don't think government does innovation very well. So what they like to have is competitions where they can compare various technologies and work out which one's the best value for money. Now, if you're trying to get something really new and exciting off the ground, you're the only company that does it, then being told you have to wait until other companies catch up so we can choose between a few of you isn't going to work, right? That isn't how you create leading technologies which can then be exported around the world. So I do think there needs to be a fundamental rethink in how we approach innovation, and also in the Treasury, I think a rethink in how we think through investment in infrastructure. So those are challenges that I know you'll have come up with, and everybody who's encountered the Treasury has come up with. I know those conversations do happen within those four walls of that building.
Well, the innovation question is, again, one that I've tackled or tried to tackle and bang my head against a brick wall with for many years now, in that it feels to me a little bit Sir Humphrey, particularly within what was BEIS, the Department of Business at the time. You would get to a place where it felt like they'd picked the winner with electrification. It felt like they'd picked a winner that we're just going to electrify everything. Electric cars are the future. Hydrogen cars, not interested. Any sort of alternative fuel, we're not really interested. And one of the things that I tried to push is, because the alternative is also wrong. I mean, I was a big, and still am to some extent, a big advocate of hydrogen. I think hydrogen can play a much bigger role in our energy mix, even actually in vehicles, but I also appreciate that I could be wrong on it. And my communication with government, and particularly the civil service who are pushing this, is I could be wrong, but so could you. And one of the things that government doesn't do well is it doesn't do technology. It's not very good at being agnostic about technology. Like you say, it likes to pick winners. And what we need to do, I think, around innovation, I'd be interested to get your views on this in the few short minutes we've got left, is how do we get to a government policy that allows for good research, good development, good innovation, without picking the winner, but almost creates an environment where it's technology agnostic and more outcome driven. Because at the minute it's not. It's very much we want to prescribe the type of technology, and hopefully it'll deliver the outcomes we want, which seems backwards to me.
Well, so I mean, you're absolutely right, and this was something that I argued for a lot in government and made some speeches on, is that we should be much more technology agnostic. And one of the things I heard in the department a lot was that we'd had invented all the technology that we needed. It was just a question of delivery and implementation. Now, that hasn't been true in the entire history of humanity, and let alone facing such a major global challenge. And so also thinking about our conservative principles, our beliefs in free markets, and the ability for consumers to choose products, making it more likely that you get better products, I think it's absolutely critical that we get more technology agnostic in this space. And one of the challenges you've got is the current architecture around how we're doing net zero is very prescriptive. So you have a lot of targets and they get ever more narrowing, and you get to a point where you're going to start dictating what consumers should buy, you know, at what price, in what quantities, in what year. And that is basically central planning by the back door. And the one thing that we know is that central planning does not go well with innovation. And so we need to leave more room, I think, for businesses to compete with their products. And there's lots of people, by the way, who are in that sort of bucket of net zero industry who agree with that, who think, actually, my products are good enough to win over consumers, and I don't need government sort of setting out quotas telling them to buy it, because I'll be able to win them over. And if you don't do that, I think there's a real risk that you're basically directing productive capital to the wrong products, and ultimately you'll end up, as we've done in the past with centrally planned economies, you know, lakes of milk and mountains of butter, and your factories piled high with milk that nobody wants. And so it's really important that we leave that space, because we're not just competing for British consumers, in my mind, we're competing for consumers around the world. And if those other countries are then, you know, leapfrogging us in terms of technologies because we haven't left space here, then you'll end up with, again, you know, loss of jobs, loss of investment, and ultimately being behind. So I think there is a way to do that. And again, I think that's quite an optimistic vision for how we do net zero. I think having a much more sort of free market competitive model is something that we're actually very good at generally in this country. And if we can do that, you know, we'll reap all the rewards.
Yeah. And again, I think one of the things we've seen, which just echoes exactly what you said, is in recent weeks, we've heard from parts of the car industry that they think they're actually going to have to start rationing the sale of, in effect, combustion engines, normal cars, petrol and diesel cars, because of the targets the government have imposed upon them on the sale of electric cars, which again goes to exactly that point. We can have plentiful, cheap cars that are hybrids and starting to decarbonise, but actually you're going to have car manufacturers rationing the sale of cars, and that's just one element of the whole economy.
Well, the one that I had was in my department was the clean heat marketing mechanism.
Yes,
which was probably one of my more controversial moments.
Yes,
exactly.
Yeah,
so
I'd read that you were quite anti. Am I right in saying you were quite anti-heat pump?
It was one of my more controversial moments. But so I'm not anti-heat pumps. Okay. I was anti the quotas, to be honest, because what we were saying is in every single year we'll set you a quota of heat pumps that you have to sell, and this is particularly placed on boiler manufacturers. And if you don't sell them, we will fine you. And the problem that I had with that is, firstly, I mean, heat pumps will work for a lot of homes. They won't work for every home. We know that. Yeah. And actually, we also know that we haven't really cracked the cost curve. So at the moment, there is a government subsidy, a helping hand, which is fine. But, I think it's about 300,000 homes in the country at the moment which have heat pumps. We haven't had the same level of adoption that we have in Europe. That's for a broad host of reasons. And I know we don't have time to go into all of those things. But there definitely is more innovation that needs to happen. And that was being done, by the way. There are some great companies in the UK who are doing a lot of these things. But my point was, we need to let those companies compete for consumers, because actually it may be that we don't have the right product that works here in the UK. It may be something that we haven't heard of yet. It may be, something which is more hybrid. It may be something which works in a completely different way. But at the moment, because we haven't cracked it, to have quotas, I think, is a mistake. And the worry that I had is that you just end up raising the price of gas boilers for people who've got nowhere else to go, whose home can't have a heat pump.
Yeah.
And actually, I think therein lies social unrest, and again, a loss of that consensus around net zero. So overall, I just think we need to take a much more sensible approach to all of these things.
No, it's a great point, because again, I think I'd read, and I'll get the statistic wrong, about a third of homes aren't actually suitable for heat pumps. It's not a small number. It was quite a significant percentage. Even if I've got that slightly wrong, it was still tens of percent. It wasn't kind of 2 or 3% of homes. So, I mean, to wrap this up, I'll phrase the question in a negative, but no doubt you can bring it back to hopefully something more optimistic. If you were to sit here again in, say, 3 or 4 years' time, where do you think under this government we're going to end up in relation to, one, our energy policy, and two, what that's going to mean for the man and woman in the street?
So I think the signs at the moment are pointing towards Labour being very, very focused on intermittent, so your wind and your solar. And I think they are going to put that on to the system in a way that dominates, which the grid hasn't caught up with yet. And actually, I think that's going to make the system very expensive. So I think people are going to have higher bills. I think they're going to be wondering what on earth they were sold at the election. And I worry that also that will have a big effect on the economy and on businesses, as well on household finances. That's what I worry about. Obviously, as our job of the opposition, we'll be asking questions, we'll be holding them to account, and hopefully trying to make sure that sensible decisions are being made. And I do believe, like I said before, that there is an important battle of ideas to be had. And the thing that I want to see from my position, and if I stay as Shadow Energy Secretary, will be, can we get the right evidence in place? Can we do this in a way which is, yes, focused on an energy transition, which, as I said, and we've talked about a lot, how that could be very good for the UK, but ultimately based on reason, on ration, and doing it in a way that works for Britain.
Well, that's been absolutely fascinating, Claire. Maybe we can get you back on in that 3 or 4 years' time and find out whether the things are going to deteriorate in the way that we think, or whether an alternative technology appears that solves all of our problems. But it's been a fascinating talk. I hope the listeners of the Blueprint podcast have found it equally as interesting. It's been an absolute pleasure, Claire.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Blueprint podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home with me, Ben Houchin. Remember, you can like and subscribe on all of our social media channels, and you can catch a new episode every single Wednesday wherever you get your usual podcasts from.